September 2nd, 1854, Soho, London. A baby named Frances Lewis died before sunrise. Her mother Sarah washed out the soiled clothes and tipped the laundry water into the cesspool directly across from their front door on Broad Street. Nobody noticed. Within days, more than 500 people in the surrounding streets were dead. The worst cholera outbreak London had seen in years, concentrated in a few blocks, killing faster than the parish could record the names. The city had an explanation. It was confident in that explanation. It was completely wrong. One doctor had been trying to tell them the right answer for 5 years. They weren't listening. And when he finally showed them the evidence that proved it, they removed the pump handle, declared the crisis over, and put the handle back. He died 8 years later without knowing he had won. This is not the story you've heard about Jon Snow. The famous version ends with a heroic gesture and a saved city. The real one is slower, stranger, and considerably darker. To understand why this story matters, you have to understand what London believed about disease in 1854. The dominant theory was miasma, bad air. The idea that cholera came from atmospheric poison, from the smell of rot and sewage and the thick, foul air that hung over crowded urban neighborhoods. It wasn't a fringe idea. It was the scientific consensus, backed by serious men, written into official reports, embedded in how the city understood sickness. The logic wasn't stupid for its time. Cholera outbreaks did tend to hit the poorest, most crowded, worst-smelling parts of the city. The correlation between filth and death was real. The explanation people built from that correlation was wrong, but it wasn't random. It fit the evidence they had chosen to look at. Jon Snow had been arguing against miasma theory since 1849. He was a physician in his late 30s, widely respected as an anesthetist. He would later serve as personal anesthetist to Queen Victoria, but his ideas about cholera were considered eccentric. In 1849, he published a pamphlet called On the Mode of Communication of Cholera, arguing that the disease spread through contaminated water, person to person. It had almost no impact. The medical establishment read it, noted it, and moved on. 5 years later, he was still arguing the same thing. Nobody was listening any harder. When the Broad Street outbreak began on August 31st, 1854, Snow lived nearby. He recognized the pattern immediately. Cases concentrated in a tight geographic cluster, and he started walking. What Snow did over the next week deserves more attention than it usually gets. He didn't sit down and draw a map. He walked the streets of Soho in late summer, knocking on doors, interviewing grieving families, tracing each death back to a specific address and a specific water source. He was building an argument from evidence, one household at a time. He found things that didn't fit miasma theory and fitted his theory exactly. A brewery on Broad Street. The workers drank beer. The brewery had its own water supply. And not one of them had died of cholera, despite being surrounded by the worst of the outbreak. If bad air was the cause, the brewery workers should have been as vulnerable as anyone else on that street. They weren't. A workhouse nearby, large population, crowded conditions, exactly the environment miasma theory predicted would be catastrophic. The workhouse had its own well. Almost nobody inside had died. And then the deaths themselves. Of the cases he could investigate in detail, the overwhelming majority had been regular users of the Broad Street pump. Many of the outliers, people who lived closer to other pumps, turned out to have specifically preferred the Broad Street water and walked past nearer pumps to get it. The pattern pointed to one source. On September 7th, 6 days into his investigation, Snow presented his findings to the Board of Guardians of St. James's Parish. A local physician named Edwin Lankster remembered the meeting clearly afterward. He was not believed, Lankster wrote, not a member of his own profession, not an individual in the parish believed that Snow was right. But they removed the pump handle the following day. This is where the story usually ends. Doctor, map, pump handle, epidemic over. But if you want to subscribe before we get to the part nobody tells, now's the moment. Hidden stories, real history, the version underneath the famous one. Every subscriber keeps this going. Now, what actually happened next? The pump handle was removed on September 8th, 1854. What the popular version doesn't mention is that the outbreak had already peaked. The worst days had been September 1st and 2nd, immediately after the Lewis baby died and Sarah Lewis emptied the laundry water into the cesspool. By the time the handle came off, the epidemic was in decline. Residents had fled the neighborhood in terror. The immediate catastrophe was passing. The removal of the handle did not stop the outbreak. The outbreak was stopping. Snow himself acknowledged in his later writing that the epidemic had already reached its climax before the intervention. This doesn't diminish what Snow did. It complicates the story in a way that's actually more interesting, because the authorities who removed the handle didn't believe Snow's explanation. They responded to an urgent threat. When the threat passed, they did what institutions do. They put the handle back. The official scientific committee tasked with investigating the 1854 outbreak produced a report that acknowledged some possible role for water while carefully declining to abandon miasma theory. Their conclusion was that either air or water might carry infection. Which is to say, they gave Snow partial credit, while leaving the door open for the theory he had specifically disproved. And then there's the map. The famous map. Deaths marked as stacked bars around the Broad Street pump, one of the most reproduced images in the history of public health, was published in 1855, in the second edition of Snow's book. By the time that map appeared, the well was closed, the epidemic was months over, and the scientific controversy was unresolved. The map is a brilliant piece of epidemiological visualization, but it is not what removed the pump handle. It came after the handle was removed. Snow's arguments removed the handle, his walking, his interviewing, his logical presentation to a skeptical parish board. The map was a retrospective document, a way of making visible the patterns Snow had already identified by other means. Most retellings have this backwards. The map feels like the decisive moment because it's the image that survived. The actual decisive moment was a doctor knocking on doors in late summer and counting who was sick and who wasn't. Snow spent the years after 1854 building the stronger case. He called it the grand experiment, and it's the proof that should be as famous as the pump handle and isn't. Two water companies served overlapping parts of South London. The Southwark and Vauxhall Waterworks Company drew from the sewage-contaminated Lower Thames. The Lambeth Waterworks Company drew from cleaner water upstream at Seething Wells. The company's pipes ran through the same streets. In some terraces, one house was supplied by one company and the next house by the other. The residents were otherwise comparable. Same streets, similar incomes, similar living conditions. Snow compared the cholera death rates between households supplied by each company. Homes supplied by Southwark and Vauxhall had a cholera mortality rate approximately 14 times higher than homes supplied by Lambeth. The only meaningful difference between those households was their water source. Worth stopping there for a second. This is controlled experimental reasoning applied to a live city population in 1854. Snow couldn't assign people randomly to water companies, but he didn't need to. London had done it for him. Two companies, overlapping geography, comparable residents, one crucial difference. The evidence was as clean as field epidemiology gets. The medical establishment remained largely unconvinced. John Snow died on June 16, 1858. He was 45 years old. A stroke, connected by those close to him to the relentless pressure of his work and his continued frustration at the slow progress of his ideas. He had been right about cholera since 1849. He had the field investigation, the brewery anomaly, the workhouse exception, the grand experiment with its 14 times mortality difference. He had the map. He had 9 years of evidence. He died without vindication. His chief opponent, William Farr, one of the most respected statisticians in Victorian England, had spent years collecting data he believed supported miasma theory. Some of that data, read honestly, also supported Snow's theory. Farr read it his way. It wasn't until 1866, 8 years after Snow's death, that another cholera outbreak in East London finally forced Farr's hand. He investigated the water supply. He found what Snow would have found. He issued orders that unboiled water was not to be drunk. He acknowledged that contaminated water was the cause. Farr accepted Snow's theory in 1866. Snow had published it in 1849. 17 years. Long enough for the man who proved it to die first. The city was looking at the air. The answer was in the water. The clue was in the brewery workers who didn't get sick, in the workhouse with its own well, in the families who told Snow they always preferred the Broad Street water even when other pumps were closer. Snow walked the streets and found it. He presented it to people who didn't believe him. They removed the handle and then put it back. The map everyone remembers came after the fact. The proof that actually changed minds is the one almost nobody mentions. He was right for 17 years before the room caught up with him. The famous version of this story ends with a pump handle coming off and a city saved. The real version ends with a man who built the evidentiary foundation of modern epidemiology and died before anyone officially admitted he had. Nobody noticed what he was actually showing them. Not until it was too late for him to know. Thank you for watching. If you want more of the real version of history, the slower, stranger, more honest one, subscribe and leave a comment. Tell me what story you think deserves this treatment. See you next time.